I've got a 16-year-old. She attends high school. I can't imagine putting her in the woods and hiding her and paying a smuggler to send her to another country because I was afraid that she was going to die or be killed or be ransomed or be held hostage. I mean, it's just unthinkable. And just to hear that story from someone and be invited into a home, like you said, of meager proportion, was quite an experience. An experience that I'll never forget. Hey everybody, welcome to the 3880 podcast. I'm your host, Jason Hager, and on this podcast, we engage with people who are doing extraordinary things all around the world and hope to help them tackle the issues, challenges, and tensions that they face. Our hope in each episode is to inform you and to provide you real, practical ways for you to take some action steps towards some of these challenges, big or small. You can follow along by subscribing to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Music. And if you want to get in touch with me or any of the guests on the show, check out the show notes for our email addresses or follow me on Twitter where my handle is @3880WV. Thanks for joining in, and we really hope you're enjoying learning, growing, and being challenged to make a difference alongside of us globally. Let's talk about our trip. So you organized and orchestrated a 12-day tour / I'll call it working tour, I guess. I was tired every day, which is a good thing. Chad Cobb and I calculated we had 10 different airplane flights and I think 2 to 4 train rides to get to some of these locations. But we started our journey in Amsterdam, and I know that you've lived there. You talked about your family moving there to be a part of the church plant to support what was going on there. We had a great experience there, and I guess, as you mentioned, the 4 stages of four ways that the refugees kind of go through this system, you would classify Amsterdam as that 4th category of a place where they can land and try to create a new life. Yes?
Yeah, I would say that. I would say that in any generalization like that, you're going to have people that are stage 1. We've met stage 1 people in Amsterdam. They were a couple weeks in Europe, and they were just fighting for their very lives. You're going to find stage 3 and 4 people down in Lesbos in Greece because they haven't been able to make their way out of Greece at this point. So those are generalizations, but yes. And to say that there's different ways of ministering all along. And part of the reason for just putting them in those categories as we experienced and we'll talk about throughout our trip or throughout our conversation here was there were different ways of meeting needs along that refugee highway.
Yeah, there was a couple of highlights for me, I think, from Amsterdam. There were 2 things that stand out. One is the cafe that's connected to the facility there, the housing, the refugee camp, as I'll call it. And you described that very, very well. It's shipping containers or something like that, some type of shipping container that have been retrofitted to be housing, and families can stay together. And the camp was very sterile feeling, very dry, very white. But the basic needs are met there. Folks can come in and out. They can live together there. They can get a meal. They can, they can be a part of society for the most part. The cafe gives you guys a very unique opportunity to build relationships. Tell me a little bit more about the cafe there.
So the cafe, like most of the places we went in Europe and the places ministering to refugees, the government has been overwhelmed with the sheer number of those seeking asylum. And so in each place along the way, the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, or we call them in the States nonprofits,
right?
They come alongside and work together with the government. So Cafe 5, as it's called, was set up and designed to be able to give refugees who have been granted asylum or who are near being granted asylum a way to work, a way to earn some money, a way to have a new skill set, again, most of the people that are serving in the cafe, whether it's as a barista or maybe they were working on tailoring, they have a tailoring business run out of there. Whatever it was, many of them are overqualified for the work they're doing, but they have to start from scratch in that. And so Cafe 5 is a mix of the refugee community being able to apply business skills and maybe some of their trade together with the local community who can come in and take advantage of the training and the services that are being provided by the refugees. So it's really a win-win.
And so the opportunity to do ministry there is a little bit of a challenge, as we learned during the trip, that the government and the organizations that are managing the camps really feel like, they're very wary of folks coming in. And the term that I heard used was taking advantage of people who are in vulnerable situations. So how do you guys how do your the missionaries that are there in Amsterdam, what's their approach to ministry there?
Let's take, for example, the camp that is immediately connected to Cafe 5. Those are called closed camps, which means the public is not allowed there. You have to have identification and or a purpose for being in the camp. And as you've mentioned, Jason, the reason for that was that people wouldn't be preying off highly vulnerable people, not just from a spiritual or religious standpoint, but there's a lot of other things that are going on along the Refugee Highway.
Right.
Whether that is trying to recruit back into more of a jihadist militant mindset, that could be for the sex slave trade.
Yep.
It could be exploiting minors and women. And so that's the purpose for it. What we found, there's been many ways that we've gained access because we have been invited virtually into all the closed camps where we've ministered. And it's usually through relationship. Many of the people that are in Amsterdam, for example, that are in the camp, they now have their basic needs met. They had food, they had clothes, they had covering over their head. And granted, it was meager and it wasn't much, but they had those things covered. What they didn't have is they didn't have somebody to share their story with. They didn't have somebody to talk to. They didn't have somebody who would just love on them and befriend them. So we've done everything from offering cultural enrichment days where we'll take refugees out into the city and show them the history and the culture of the Netherlands. We've done things where we've invited them into events just for the purpose of giving them an opportunity to get away from these tight and closed, confined areas, to be able to enjoy conversation, to enjoy games, to enjoy sports, just to enjoy
just to feel like they're living again and have community around them. I think that's one thing that I noticed, is that they feel isolated, they feel alone, and just to share a conversation over a cup of coffee was, sometimes maybe the highlight of their day, of their week.
Well, as you witnessed there in each of the places that we were at, most of the cultures that they're coming from, they'd be considered more warm culture, warm climate cultures, which means time isn't as important to them as relationship is.
Right.
And so in each of those places, a high value on family, a high value on friends, and a high value on any new relationships. And so we were overwhelmingly greeted in each of the places just because we took an interest to share the love of God with them.
Yeah. My second highlight, I think, from Amsterdam, and there were, I could say all of it was a highlight, but the two things that stand out, the second one was the time we spent at STEC Oost. Maybe describe what's happening there, what that facility is, and how Patricia and her team are ministering there.
Yeah, STEC it's a little bit of a governmental experiment. It's also containers, and with Dutch and German engineering, you see these things, and they stack these trucking containers up, and they put facades on them. They put windows in them. They put staircases to them. They run plumbing. It's absolutely amazing.
And I would say I've seen worse housing. I mean, I'm and not that I would want to live in a container, but knowing the perspective of what they're coming from, but finding a place. I mean, it's pretty ingenious to see these camps.
Well, as you saw all along the Refugee Highway at the landing spot in Lesvos, it was extremely meager.
Right.
Maybe a mat to sleep on in the open air.
Yeah.
All the way through some of these more finished off containers. However, the population in each one of those is usually a little higher than most of us would welcome. But STEC Ost is an experiment a little bit. They've seen success with it, and that is they're mixing university students with the younger refugees who have been granted asylum. And so they're putting them not necessarily in the same container, but in the same housing complex. And so STEC Ost is that. It's on the east side of the center of Amsterdam, and it's close to where one of our missionary families lives. And it's opened a door of opportunity to minister both to the young Dutch who are studying, but also to reach out to the refugees. And because of just years of building favor, we've had the opportunity to provide events there. For example, the night that you and Chad and I were there, we got to advertise a week in advance that there was going to be a conversation about love and faith. And they were able to put flyers up around. And if you remember, there was maybe 6 or 7 that showed up. On time is relative when you're dealing with young people and you're dealing with people from non-time oriented cultures. But by the end of the time, I would say there were between 20 and 25 people who had made their way in and had some portion of hearing a Jesus story. And what was it like for you to? I set you up in advance.
You did
to be able to share a Jesus story, one of the gospel stories. What was it like for you to be sharing the story of the prodigal son?
It was a great experience. Coming into it, I have a Young Life background, as we've discussed, and I thought, let's break the ice with a game. So if you're listening to this and you've been to Young Life Club, you know what I'm talking about. It wasn't quite a Young Life Club, but it was close. And I think that what I realized was that regardless of what you believe or what religion you claim as your own, the culture of the people that were there were very open to hearing a story and talking about it. And I guess when I say talking about it, I mean debating fiercely. Luckily for me, I've had a little bit of experience with the Arab culture and some of the other cultures that were represented, and that's just part of who they are. And I didn't find it really intimidating per se, but it is kind of a faith check for a lot of people that might find themselves in that situation, to sit down and then have to, I won't say argue, but I'll say debate the story and talk about every nuance of the story with questions that are just getting peppered from folks. And, we had a wonderful gentleman from Jerusalem who was translating, and he is a follower of Christ. And I looked at his Bible, and his Bible is just like, notes and cards and Post-its. And it was so, and it was in Arabic. And I just looked at him, and as he was translating, I could see the passion in his eyes, and he's used to that kind of debate culture. And it was a magical experience for me. I really felt like the Holy Spirit was there with us. And I think afterwards, having conversations with a couple of the students, just kind of one-on-one, one I know was from from Amsterdam. He had kind of fallen out of religion. His parents didn't really have a preference as to what he believes or what they believe, and he was really asking some great questions about Jesus and about why and about how. Um, and I think, as I've heard from Patricia, a couple of emails, that he's continuing to explore that. And I think what a great opportunity to have a relational ministry in an area where you can impact so many people. And again, it was just it was a great experience for me.
One of the things that's been strategic for our teams that are overseas is when the short-term teams come in, and the short-term team can be 2 to 4 people, kind of like us. When they come in, they create an energy and can build a little bit of a critical mass around an event that carries them over for weeks and months forward, giving the workers there the opportunity to engage more deeply on spiritual conversations. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, Jason, there's even ongoing Bible studies now.
Yep.
As a result of our time there. I think you highlight a couple of things in what you were saying as well that we found all across the Refugee Highway, and that is most of the people that we're talking with are very spiritually minded. Mm-hmm. It is a different apologetic. When somebody you're not starting with the existence of God and the formation of the world and humanity as we know it, and is there a literal heaven and hell? You're really you're starting with, there's a respect and an honor for God. And there's an embracing of spiritual conversation. And so it's such a joy and a little bit of overwhelming surprise that we can have these kinds of gospel conversations so readily. That the 20 or so people that were in there included a gal who said she was an atheist. She's mm-hmm. Syrian and she's an atheist, and she sat there the whole time.
Yeah,
and she wanted to be involved in the dialogue.
Yeah, she was engaged in the conversation and very vocal about her thoughts. But the willingness and openness to share that and to stay there the whole time, to me, was a testament to the respect that I think those students have. Maybe because we're older than them or whatever it was, but I was really impressed. And even a few of the Muslim students that were there, we had great conversations with them afterwards, and very what I would call a positive, productive conversation. And I'm a believer in kind of the Young Life model of let's plant the seed and let's move someone in their faith as best we can, and be a part of that sharing of the gospel. And we take them from maybe a -5 to a 1, and then they continue to explore, and someone else gets involved in their life, and they continue to come to STEC for a Bible study or just for the pizza, but they continue to climb that ladder, and at some point, it's my hope and prayer that they become a follower. But to have those conversations and for them to be open was really a surprise to me.
You were reading my mind on the Ingalls scale there, yeah. A little bit. That the Ingalls scale is just a way of, for those that aren't as familiar, it's just a way of assessing where somebody at in their spiritual interest and in their spiritual journey. And if 0 is at a point of conversion and +1 to +5 is progress that they've made as a follower and believer in Christ, mm-hmm. then there's, depending on whose scale you read, anywhere from a -8, -10, or -12. Those are people that are at different degrees far from God. Right. And I think what you're saying there is what we found all along the Refugee Highway is, rather than saying our humanitarian aid is not of help, it could have been just through one quick moment of asking to pray for them, or telling them you're a Jesus follower, or hugging and smiling on them, move them from a -8 far from God to a -7. And we spend all of our time hoping for that -1 to 0 conversion to +1 early followership. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the reality is a lot of our work takes people from somewhere in the minus category closer to the -1 to 0. Yeah. And so if we're helping make progress, man, hallelujah. And we'll probably towards the end, when we talk about Lesbos a little bit, we'll hear of a little bit more of the -1 to 0.
Yeah, absolutely. So our next stop was Cologne, Germany, where we had the chance to meet a number of wonderful people, some locals there who were part of a church plant. Martin, the college professor, who was also the pastor of the church, Matteo, his wife, Michael and Nia, all really just bought into this idea of kind of going into the harvest and reaching refugees. And again, the mindset of let's try to have a relationship. Let's be someone they can talk to. Let's go, let's have a relational conversation. And that turns into opportunities to share the love of Christ. So, thoughts on Cologne? How did it get started? What's happening there?
Yeah, Cologne got started through a summer project of university students. We had actually started 2 years prior. And the first year we were up in Stockholm, Sweden for 3.5 weeks. The next year we went and joined another organization because we'd heard of the success that they'd have in Hamburg, Germany. And this was our third year in. So this will be 2 summers ago now, was our third year in. And it was during that time that God really grabbed a hold of a couple of the students who were thinking they might want to be doing cross-cultural ministry. And so God grabbed a hold of their life during that summer and directed them to joining up with the church plant that had started 15 years ago there, but with a different focus. Rather than university students, their focus would be on those coming through on the Refugee Highway. Mm-hmm. And so it really started just from summer teams going out, God grabbing hold of hearts. And right now there's 4 who have made the permanent move there. There's 1 in the support raising mode, and there's 8 others who are in process because they're still finishing university workup.
Right.
That in the next 1 to 2 years will be readily available and eagerly pursuing the opportunity to serve, whether it's there in Cologne or somewhere else, reaching refugees that are coming into Europe. So
yeah, the couple of things that stand out from again, we had a short amount of time in each place, but we took full advantage for sure. Where was the time where we went to the park, and the park is situated next to a lot of the refugee housing, and we just sat down beside people and just started talking. And I will be the first to admit that that's way outside of my comfort zone, but the stories that we heard and their willingness to just share stories of how they got into the country and sort of their path in. Again, a lot of them are heartbreaking, but it was an amazing experience to sit down in a park, and then most of them in Germany obviously speak German. So having those conversations with them, and then Matteo or Michael or Nia translating their stories and just asking a few questions and really just kind of listening was a very unique opportunity. And their goal is to share Christ with these people, and some of them were very, very willing to talk about it, and some of them were very closed off. But we had all those experiences. I was spending some time praying a little bit, and a guy started shooting basketball there in the park, and I had a chance to go up and just shoot some hoops with him and start a very quick dialogue of his story. And just to do that was amazing. Spoke very little English, but we were able to have a really interesting conversation.
I think leading into the trip, as you and Chad and I were talking, I was trying to frame it as realistically as I could, that we would be uh, uh, all along this highway. There would be specific things that we'd be going after,
Right.
and some of it was, we're going to be out in the gospel. I mean, we're going to be at the grassroots level.
Yeah.
There are initiative things that we do. Is that the most effective or the only tool? Absolutely not. But in the absence of having relationships, persons of peace, we'll talk about one of the families we sat down with who's really a person of peace and what it means to be a person of peace in gospeling. But we talked about it. I think the word you guys used was granular. You were pleasantly surprised and excited how granular it was, that we're just out in the street. It doesn't mean we didn't do events. Amsterdam was a little bit of an event, but it opened the door for these direct conversations. And when we talk about Thessaloniki and Lesbos, it was humanitarian service, but it opened the doors for these gospeling conversations. But all along the way, people were hearing the gospel, and our goal was to bridge conversation and service into the gospel. And I think the Lord really opened those doors in countless ways. Even people that were serving us food or people that we were running into as part of our cultural enrichment and going on parts of tours. We were constantly just looking for ways to turn a conversation into a spiritual one, if that's where they wanted to go and where they were interested.
And I think that's it's a lost art, possibly for the church, the church culture in America. And I don't want to disparage anybody or anyone, but I do think that we're not challenged in our faith like that as much, possibly, as maybe in the past. And I don't know why that is, and it's just a product of culture, possibly, or not finding ways to engage in that. But I was definitely refreshed with the with the charge of going out and just starting conversations with people, in a way that, hey, we want to share Christ, we want to share this love with you, we want to share the story of the gospel. And I did appreciate the fact that was the mindset of just about every conversation.
Well, I would say that one of the, sorry for the phone ringing in the background, everybody.
We're all working here.
This is a real live conversation going on. Just so you know, I'm really alive. No. A couple of points or a couple of thoughts out of that, and then maybe a quick story. One is, I just think what really captured my heart years ago was I as a part of what's now the broader Great Commission movement and many other movements, but I just saw people who read God's word with a heart to obey it. I saw people who were out taking responsibility for sharing their faith, and then they were gathering together with others who had a like mind. And when I stepped into Europe in 2003, and we gathered together with about 25 missionary and national pastors, we kind of had that gut check of what did we buy into and why are we doing what we're doing and what is it we want to be about. And it was really those three things. If there's anything we can pass on to a new believer, to somebody who wants to follow Christ, it's just, can you hear from God? And are you hearing from God? And are you willing to do what he asks? And do you see that he can speak to you, but also through you? And are you out sharing your faith? Are you proclaiming the goodness of God wherever you're at and learning how to do that in a comfortable, unforced, natural way? And then, hey, we all need one another to make that happen. And so it really was granular. It was grassroots. I mentioned the idea of a person of peace, and I'll talk about that again later. But through the summer projects 2 years ago, they met one of the U City guys. And if you remember, we sat down, and it is not uncommon to have an entire multi-course feast put in front of you to the point where I can't even begin to fathom
Yeah.
eating everything that's being put in front of
Yeah.
me. And it
That
was
was,
through.
yeah,
Go ahead.
that was definitely the second highlight, but yeah, keep going.
Well, what I was going to say is that the culture is a very um, uh, relational culture. It's a very giving culture. Here we are sitting with a young Yazidi couple, newlyweds, only by a few months, and they open up their home.
Right.
They didn't even have enough resources to afford furniture,
Right.
so we're sitting on probably their bed mattresses,
Yep.
scattered all over the floor, and they just bring out course after course of food to eat and to share with us and to communicate the respect and the honor. And as a side note, I definitely want to hear your reflection on the time as we got to go through the gospel yet again with them. But a side note, the missionary families that were there, they a few months before, they had earned such a place of trust and respect that they were the only non-Yazidis that were invited to their wedding, and there were over 700 Yazidis at that
And we got
wedding.
to see some great video of that.
We did. That was, I try to explain to my wife, yes, they love to dance
For hours and hours and hours.
And they have certain sounds in celebration that they make that you wouldn't normally hear out on the streets in a large city. But yeah, it was just, it's a very honoring and respectful culture. And so I think we were sitting at the home of a person of peace who is introducing our missionary team to countless others that their life touches. And there we were, the recipients of being blessed by that. And with them sitting there listening with great eagerness and desire to hear our hearts and what, the story that God had given us. That, to me, that's precious. And that was one example of countless times that's happened over the last several years as we've been ministering to those coming from the refugees coming from the Middle East, Near East, and North Africa.
And what I love about that experience is the fact that their efforts in the harvest paid off with this relationship. And so Talal, who is the gentleman we're talking about, in his early 20s, I believe it was, newly married, had a relation, it started to establish a relationship with Mateo and Michael, and invited us all over for dinner. And his wife prepared an amazing feast, is probably putting it lightly. I don't think I've ever been that full, and there was so much food left over. I felt really bad. But just for him to take that next step and be open and willing to share his experience, and I guess maybe as an aside on this story, the Yazidi faith, I had never really even heard of, and probably we won't go into it now, but just the what they believe and the premise of their faith. Most of the generation, his generation, Talal's generation, doesn't really I don't think they really understand the faith that they've been taught, but that's because that's what they were taught. That's what they associate to. But that night of him sharing his journey at 17, I think it was, he was hiding in the woods. He had fled, was put on a boat, was smuggled across the water, was stuffed into a van with 20, 30, 40. I don't remember what the total number is. I've got the story on audio, which I'll publish as well at some point with permission. But just to hear him talk about how hard that was and what a challenge that, especially I've got a 16-year-old. She attends high school. I can't imagine putting her in the woods and hiding her and paying a smuggler to send her to another country because I was afraid that she was going to die or be killed or be ransomed or be held hostage. I mean, it's just unthinkable. And just to hear that story from someone and be invited into a home, like you said, of meager proportion, was quite an experience. An experience that I'll never forget. And I think, you shared your story that night, kind of your journey of faith, which I can only imagine had a fairly profound impact. And he started asking questions. And again, those guys have been working with Talal and meeting with him regularly. And I think beginning to share some scripture with him. And it sounds like that he's responding. And what else could you ask for?
Yeah, just on an encouraging note as well, Mateo, who turned the missionary, he turned 30 after we left.
Yep.
A few days later, and Talal and his wife, and his newlywed wife, they were there at their at the 30th birthday party.
At the big surprise party.
At the big surprise party, yeah, which is really interesting. They've only lived there in Cologne since February. I was there in June as a part of the university students outreach last summer, and they had their firstborn born during that time, and they had a neighborhood and refugee party. They had about 30 people come from that. They'd only been there 4 months,
That's
and
amazing.
this one had about 30 people there, and they've been there now 8 months, and so. Just the influence of being available in the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that was highlighted even in what you were saying there is most young people, and I would say this is true across the board, this is unofficial stats, but I would say 90% of the people that are migrating into Europe, coming in as refugees, somewhere in the 90% are probably more cultural in their orientation to their faith and religion,
right,
rather than devout or, as some of us know, extremists.
Right.
And so because of that, I think this is the first time they're a little bit disenfranchised. Their culture is not just their religious system, but it's their judicial, their educational, their political, their military. So it's all encompassing. Their family system, the media system, everything is wrapped up in their culture. That's all they know. And so now, for the first time, their culture is someone in that process, whether it's the military or the political party or the religious party, has really let them down. And that's the reason that they're migrating. Because of that, it's allowed them to be open to questions that maybe they couldn't ask under their prior living conditions. And so, they're asking questions for the first time. So,
and even
Talal and his wife are examples of that they really want to engage in spiritual conversations, even though they're probably still a -2, 3, or 4 on our scale of things, but they've moved along. So,
and I think, speaking of the culture, and I don't know that I spent a lot of time in Africa and in Europe as well, and I don't know that I have seen or felt the cultural mindset of an anti-Christian culture, and I've experienced some of that with people that we talk to. Some people were raised thinking that Christians were wanting to kill them and they hated them, and it was so disappointing, I think, to hear that was part of the culture. And yeah, I mean, this experience with Talal was really, really amazing for me. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to part 2 of the Refugee Highway. And in part 3, Joe, Chad, and I visit the Greek island of Lesbos. This was a beautiful Greek island just a stone's throw away from the border of Turkey, where refugees continue to pour in by the thousands. And we were able to tour the highly controversial Camp Moria, where tens of thousands of refugees live in a space designed for just a few thousand people. so you can listen to our experience and learn ways that you can make a difference. So make sure you tune in to the 3880 podcast on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music. Thanks for listening.